CALPADS Error Resolution CERT160. Missing private school enrollment record for an education plan type code 200 ISP. So anytime you are resolving an error in CALPADS, the first thing you should do is consult the CALPADS Error List. All right, and so we have a screenshot of the error list in front of us, and let's walk through it. We will go through it in more detail and how to use it when troubleshooting the error during the demo. Let's just familiarize you with the different elements in the error list. So on the far left, we have the error number and the error name, and we use this to match the error that we received. In this case, it's a certification error, so we're looking at the certification detail screen. We have a record that has triggered a CERT160, and we use the error number as a reference. Again, the error name helps us identify that we are referencing the correct error. The error description tells us the problem. And so this error description says students with an education plan type code 200, which is an ISP, must have a private school enrollment. Over here in the suggested resolution on the far right, there's two parts: understanding the error and suggested resolution. So we know our problem. CALPADS would tell us what's expected in the understanding the error portion. A student with a special education record where the program type is 200 ISP must be enrolled in a private school during the submission period, right? This doesn't seem like it's conditional. It says must. And then a suggested resolution. Ensure that the student enrollment record for the student is enrolled in a private school. So this is one method of resolution, right? Depending on your student data, which you know, right? This may be the method of resolution, but you might find something else. And this is the case with almost every error in CALPADS. Sometimes you have several methods of resolution. However, there are circumstances depending on your student's data that will determine what the appropriate action is, and that may not always be listed as a suggested resolution. And so the last field we're going to discuss is the fields validated. And the fields validated tell us where to look, either to identify corresponding records for comparison, but ultimately the fields validated will help us identify where we're going to find the discrepant data that is triggering the error. And so we can see in the fields validated column, we are going to look at student enrollment data and compare that to special education data, okay? And again, we demonstrate how to use this error list in the online demonstration coming up. And so the error list has identified the 200 plan type IEP as a central part in what has triggered the error. So let's look at what an ISP is. If I said IEP earlier, forgive me, we're talking about the individual service plan, or ISP. The individual service plan is a written plan for each student with a disability in Part B and enrolled in a private school. ISP statements may identify goals with specific services such as counseling, speech therapy, and enlarge materials for students with vision impairment. I think the key information is that the ISP is for students enrolled at a private school. It specifically says that in the definition in the CALPADS code set, right? So if you want to know why a student is expected to have a private school enrollment, by definition, the ISP says the student has a private school enrollment. And so the question is, why does a plan type 200 need a private school enrollment? The individualized service plan is for students attending private schools receiving services from a county office or district. So how would you normally submit data for a private school student? You want to enroll the student with the enrollment status 50. Use in the enrollment record as you use the private school group code, that's 60 followed by a 2 in the school of attendance field. The student also would have a student information record. However, the birth country and the parent ed, which is normally required, is not required. That's how a student would be enrolled. And of course, you would submit the student's service plan, which in this case would be an ISP, and the associated information. Now, under certain circumstances, and they're very rare, you may have a student who has a settlement agreement. The student's family and the school district, or LEA, had an intermediary with the court to find out which was the best way to provide the student services. In the case of a settlement agreement, how you enrolled your private school student in CALPADS is a little bit different. For students with a settlement agreement, and only for students with a settlement agreement at a private school, this is how you would enroll them. First of all, you're not going to use enrollment status 50. You're going to enroll those students with enrollment status 10. It's a primary enrollment. You don't use the private school group code. Instead, you're going to use the reporting LEA code or the CDS code, the county district code, and you're going to report the student at the district level. So the school of attendance and the reporting LEA field will have the same code. Then, in the special education program record, as per the settlement agreement, the student has an IEP, not an ISP. And that student would have the IEP record reported. The services, the meeting dates, everything prescribed by that IEP is reported in the special education program record and the services, but the settlement agreement dictates that this student has an IEP. That's how a student is enrolled and reported in CALPADS if there is a settlement agreement. And so sometimes not understanding how to properly report students and not knowing the CALPADS expectation lead to these errors. So now let's demonstrate how you would resolve a CERT160 if one should trigger for your LEA. Okay, so let's look at a student who has a record triggering a CERT160. All right, so again, we always want to start by consulting the CALPADS Error List. All right, we have a CERT160 here. The error name is Missing Private School Enrollment Record for Education Plan 200 ISP. The description says the students with an education plan type code 200 must have a private school enrollment. This is pretty straightforward. When we consider the fields validated, again, this is a CERT error, so we're going to be looking at the student's record in the CALPADS ODS. We're going to compare the student enrollment data, the SENR data, to the special education program record data. Right, we're looking at the reporting LEA, school of attendance, SSID, enrollment start date, and enrollment exit date. In the special education program data, we're going to look at the reporting LEA, SSID, special education meeting date, education plan type code, and special education amendment date. Okay, so when we think about the description, students with the education plan 200 ISP must have a private school enrollment. We're going to identify an ISP record that's in the SPED data. So that means we are going to look first for the education plan type code 200. Right? Once we identify that, we're going to look at the reporting LEA for the student and possibly the meeting date and the amendment date. Only if the student has multiple enrollments at several different schools, we have to use these dates and the reporting LEA to see what LEA that 200 record, that ISP, belongs to, right? And so we'll know that the district or the LEA from the SPED record must have a corresponding private school enrollment with the same LEA in the enrollment data. And that, if we have a student who has been transient, has had several different periods of enrollment at different LEAs, the enrollment start date and exit date could come into place, because we're going to have to match a period of enrollment through start and exit date with the specific program record, special education program record, and that's where the plan, the amendment date or the meeting date will come into place, right? So that's what we have to know. That's what we have to understand by looking at the error description and the fields validate. We have to identify what we're looking at. Then suggested resolution. So the advice for understanding the error says, a student with a SPED record where the education plan type code is 200, ISP, must be enrolled in a private school during the submission period, okay? A private school attendance in the SENR record is represented by 6 zeros followed by a 2. Again, the suggested resolution, ensure the record for the student shows that, ensure the enrollment record for the student is enrolled at a private school, or, needs a private school record. So we'll drag that out of here. And the first thing we're going to do is look at the special education record. Thankfully, the student only has 2 special education records. We can see one is an IEP, so this is not of concern right now, but the other is an ISP 200. So this is the record we're looking at. And we can see that the student was enrolled at the reporting LEA is Yuba County Office of Education. Okay, and the meeting date is June 9th, 2020. So let's go up and look at the enrollment record. So this is the most, this is the relevant enrollment, okay? The student had an exit meeting that was, the student special education record is associated to this period of enrollment, right? And that's at this, the same reporting LEA, that's how we know. And these dates are within the same academic year. So we know that that record is associated to this enrollment. And so the problem is, this is not a private school. The student has an ISP record, but not a school. So here's what needs to happen. Either this is not an ISP and it should be an IEP record like the one below it. So this record would have been opened, then deleted, okay? Or we have to change the school of enrollment. So the student would have to be at a private school, so school of attendance. Every district has a group code for a private school. So here's the private school group code. We'd have to change that, right? So those 2 methods work. Now, here's the complicated issue. What if I have a private school student who's on an IEP? How do I report that in CALPADS? So we know that students on settlement agreements, although they're few and far between, there are enough of them in the state of California that your district may have one. And so if you have a private school student that does have an IEP, the way they should be reported should be an IEP record, a primary enrollment status, but the school of attendance should be the district code. So if this student is really a private school student, however, the student has a settled agreement, they went through a court process, and that student has an IEP, the change you need to make would have to be changing the school of attendance to the district code, which is possible. Okay, so here in the school of attendance, you would change this to the district code, right? Here's the district code. You can see that the numbers are the same. So that would represent a district enrollment. And then in the special education program record, this would be an IEP. And that's only for students with the settlement agreement, okay? And that's how they would be reported. And the enrollment status is a 10. And so the reference for that is you have to go back to Flash 167. How should an LEA report a CALPADS student 6 to 22 who are enrolled in private school but have an IEP on a settlement agreement? And that guidance is given to you here. Students ages 6 to 22 attending private schools who are on IEP as part of a settlement agreement should be reported in CALPADS at the district level. This means the LEA should submit the student enrollment file with the reporting LEA and school of attendance populated with the 7-digit county district code. The enrollment status field should be a 10, primary enrollment. These students should not be enrolled in the private school group code, right? So I don't know, again, so we don't know this student's data, right? We're at the service desk and we want to help you guys out. You have to understand the student's data and make that applicable changes. If this student is a private school student, they need an enrollment record showing the private school enrollment. That's the 6 zeros followed by a 2, right? And the ISP is fine. If this student is a private school student on an IEP through a settlement agreement, then this needs to be an IEP record, and this needs to be a district enrollment, okay? And if this is just an erroneous ISP record, it needs to be deleted, and then a replacement should be submitted from your special education system. So that's, in essence, why you get a CERT160. You have a student on an ISP, private school student, enrolled in a public school. And the only time you would have that kind of enrollment is through a settlement agreement, okay? So hopefully this was helpful to you. Thank you, and good luck.